Hello and welcome back to Flipped Psychology. I'm Miss Lee, and in this unit we're talking about social psychology. We are starting out with Section 1, Attitudes and Influences. Our objectives will be for you to be able to describe the relationship between attitudes, both implicit and explicit, and behavior, including attributes associated with different types of behavior. You'll also be able to describe the situational effects and group dynamics associated with individual behavior, including how an individual can influence group norms. If you haven't done so already, go ahead and grab your notes and let's get started. Before we talk about attitudes, we need to be able to define it. Attitudes are beliefs and feelings about objects, people, and events that can affect how people behave in certain situations. So it's basically what you are bringing to the table when you are looking at anything, person, or event. But how do attitudes even develop? There are three main ways that we're going to be talking about in this video: conditioning, observational learning, and the ABCs of attitude. This is according to Albert Ellis. Operant or instrumental conditioning, it's basically a different way of saying the same thing, is when an attitude forms because it has been reinforced through reward or a pleasant experience, or discouraged through punishment or an unpleasant experience. An example of that might be a parent praising a teenager for helping at an after-school program with little kids. With this theory of attitude development, the teenager would probably develop a pretty positive attitude about after-school programs because of the praise that they received from their parent. In observational learning, this is when learning happens through watching others, retaining the information, and then later replicating the behaviors that were observed. So you basically do what you see. An example of this might be a child who grows up with parents who smoke might be more inclined to pick up a pack of cigarettes and smoke because of observational learning. And that brings us to the ABC model, which was developed by Albert Ellis. So this was a significant part of the form of therapy that he developed, known as rational emotive behavioral therapy. So we're not going to really get into the details of this type of therapy. We talked about therapy in a different unit, but basically what you need to know is that it served as a precursor or like a prequel to the widely known and applied CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. And the ABC model is still commonly used as a treatment in CBT interventions. And what ABC basically says is that a person's affect, their behavior, and their cognition all come together to form their attitude, that it has to happen with all three of these elements combining, and that is what causes someone to have a certain kind of attitude. But what if those things don't line up? What if your thoughts don't actually line up with your behavior? This is known in psychology as cognitive dissonance. This is when basically somebody acts against their belief. So you might lie about how interesting a task is. The discomfort is that you know that lying isn't the right thing to do, but you justify your action. You justify, I didn't want to hurt somebody's feelings. And so the cognitive dissonance there is you are basically rationalizing in order to make the behavior okay. One of two things happens, because basically what cognitive dissonance is it's mental discomfort when you have two conflicting beliefs, values, or attitudes. One of them has to change. So either the behavior changes or your attitude about it has to change. And so that is as a result of this cognitive dissonance, this discomfort. Attribution is the process of inferring the causes of behaviors. So you are basically explaining someone else's behaviors, and because we tend to have more information about motivations, needs, and thoughts of individuals that are closer to us, we're more likely to take account for the external forces that impact behaviors other than just simple assumptions. What that means is because of the fact that we know someone else or we know ourselves very well, we are more likely to say, oh, it was just their circumstances. They really had a rough time, to explain some bad behavior. You're less likely to do this with a stranger. You call them a jerk, or I cannot believe they did that, or whatever. You are attributing their negative behavior to characteristics of their personality. And this is part of these two different errors. First, there's the fundamental attribution error. This is the tendency to attribute other people's behaviors to their disposition, the dispositional factors of their character. And at the same time, you attribute your own actions to situations. So you may have run a red light, but you didn't want to slam on the brakes that could have caused an accident. So you're making your behavior make sense in light of the situation, but you don't give that same good grace to other people. The actor-observer bias, this is attributing other people's behaviors to their character as well as your own behavior to the situation. Okay, so let's move on to influence. This is kind of the second part of this video, and I want to talk to you about persuasion. This is how people are able to persuade others, not just in their attitude, but also their behavior. There are two basic ways of doing this. There's the central route and the peripheral route. Central route uses evidence and logical arguments to persuade people. So they use data, they use facts. They're very logical in this type of route, whereas a peripheral route is indirect, and in this route you attempt to associate objects, people, or events with positive or negative cues. This is bringing about somebody's emotions. This is trying to make somebody feel very warm and happy when they see certain things or when they're trying to conjure up that memory of something. So it's using emotions rather than logic. So let's look at this chart about what type of persuasive messages we have. We've got, again, the central route and the peripheral route. When you are talking about one route versus the other, you want to consider your audience, their processing, as well as what effect you want to have in the long run. So in a motivated and analytical audience, you want to use a central route. If your audience is not terribly motivated, not very analytical, a peripheral route will be just fine. Play on their emotions. If you are okay with others exerting high effort and evaluating your message, then the central route is probably your best bet. But if effort isn't really what you are going for, a peripheral route is probably going to be your best bet. The long-lasting effects with a central route, you tend to have a more lasting change in attitude. Someone is able to change their attitude long-term when you are using logic and facts. A peripheral route, it's a temporary change in attitude, so it's probably going to be just enough for someone to purchase a certain beverage or listen to a certain song, but it's probably not going to really change their attitude in the long run. So let's talk about group membership and behavior. The central question here is basically, how can membership in a group influence individual behavior? As I'm going over these different factors, I want you to consider what it's like working in a group. First, you've got social facilitation. This is the idea that people often perform better when others are watching them rather than when they are alone. So there are situations where working in a group or being in a group of people is going to facilitate behavior. It's going to increase that behavior. In research, we learned about a similar phenomenon known as the Hawthorne effect. The next factor in influence is social loafing. This is when people slack off and don't try as hard because they're part of a group. I'm sure you have seen this before, whether it's directly or indirectly. And then you've got this risky shift phenomenon. This is the tendency for people to take greater risks when they're part of a group than they would individually. People are more likely to do things they wouldn't normally do or that they would be more scared to do when they're in a group than if they were alone. So when we're talking about conforming, what factors actually lead people to conform to social norms? You've got a couple of factors going on here. Here are some of the big ones. There is a presence of a collectivistic culture. So people who live in a culture that stresses collectivism versus individuality is going to be, those folks are going to be more likely to conform to social norms. When that individual has a need to be liked and accepted by others, there is a greater likelihood of social confirmation. And then when there's unanimity of opinion in a group of about up to 8 members. After that, that effect kind of decreases because the individuality gets lost, right? The accountability gets lost. So let's talk about obedience. Why do people obey? Why do most people tend to obey authority figures? First, you've got this factor of socialization. People have been socialized from childhood to obey. Obey your parents, obey your teachers, obey your authority figures. Then you've got a foot in the door effect. This is the tendency for people to give in to major demands once they've given in to minor demands. So you ask for a little bit, you get it, so you ask for something bigger. Continuing on, you've got confusion about attitudes. When people are aware of their attitudes, When people are aware of their attitudes, they're more likely to follow those attitudes. They're more likely to act in accordance with those attitudes. So if you're aware of how you stand on certain topics, you're more likely to follow up with that when push comes to shove. And then buffers. When people are protected from observing the consequences of their actions, they're more likely to follow orders from authority figures, even when they're immoral ones. So before we move on, let's review what we talked about in this video. We talked about the relationship between attitude and behavior, and we talked about the attributes associated with different types of behavior. We also talked about the situational effects and group dynamics associated with individual behavior, including how an individual can influence group norms. In our next video, we'll be covering stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination. I can't wait to see you then. Bye for now.